A Heroine's Beginning. Chapter 3. I was awoken in the morning by an abrupt shake. I batted it away, like I did most mornings when one of my younger siblings decided to wake me up by jumping on me or shaking me violently. However, this morning I was met with an older girl's voice, and it took me a second to realize I was not at my home anymore, but in the servants' wing of the manor house. The sun was only just rising, and the rays could be seen stretching light above the clouds. It was bitterly cold, and a thin layer of mist hung just above the ground, swirling and fading. The sky was mainly clear, and its robin-egg blue was bright and comforting, even in the cold. I reluctantly rolled out of bed and quickly got changed into my now dry dress. I started to follow Jane out of the room, who was already changed and prepared for the day, still wearing her blood-red ribbon in her hair. She turned sharply to look at me, and sent me back into the room to fix my hair. In the process of getting changed quickly, I had neglected to do so. I asked her what was wrong with it, but she replied that if I was going to be working all day, I needed to at least tie it back. Jane sat me down on the stool, and began brushing my hair ferociously. I decided she was clearly one of those people who thought the more pain they went through, the better the result. My mother was like this. She never thought we were clean until our skin was red and raw. But to be fair, for many of my brothers, their skin never really was clean until it was in this state anyway. Jane asked if I had a ribbon or a pin, and I pointed to the small bag by my bed, which contained a single green ribbon. She pulled it out, and began to deftly gather my hair into a braid, and secure it with a ribbon. When she let go, my scalp felt a little sore, but the braid seemed very secure. We then made our way downstairs. Even though the family had not yet arisen, there was still plenty of work to be done, and Mrs. Pole made efficient use of everyone to hand. I set to work lighting the fires in the main part of the house. Then I was to accompany Jane, as she showed me how to light the fires in the bedrooms, with minimal disturbance to the family. We crept quietly along the hallway and arrived at the master bedroom. I had never believed that a room could be that size, but I was proven wrong. The room was well furnished, but not so much so that it felt like there were objects just for the sake of displaying them. It was colored a light shade of yellow, which gave it a feeling of happiness in summer. There was a large four-poster bed in the center of the wall, with blue velvet curtains drawn around it. We set to work as quickly and as quietly as we could, before tiptoeing out of the room again. We moved down the hallway to the next occupied room, which happened to be Miss Ella's. I expected to find a similar scene to the room we had previously been in, but when we opened the door, we were greeted by the sight of Miss Ella, curled up on the floor by the fire, soot and cinders staining her face. I started forward, wondering if she was okay, but Jane held me back and closed the door quietly. She explained to me how they normally find Miss Ella like this. She likes to stay up late reading, but is not permitted to leave candles burning all night, so she curls up by the light of the fire to read, and often falls asleep there. It's best not to disturb her. Jane began to head back down to the kitchen when I stopped her. "Aren't we going to light the fire in the mistress's room?" I asked. "Whatever for? The mistress isn't in there," she replied. I looked at her puzzled. "The mistress sleeps in the master's room," she explained. I don't know why I was so surprised by this. My own parents slept in the same bed, but I had always been told that high-born people like to have their own private space, and there's normally a separate bedroom for the mistress. I had been told there was a mistress's bedroom in the manor, so I had just assumed that's where she would be sleeping. I nodded in understanding, and followed Jane back to the kitchen. The rest of the day was fairly monotonous. As a scullery maid, my main job was to assist the cook, primarily washing the dirty pots, pans, and plates. I spent all morning scrubbing a particularly grimy old porridge pot that hadn't been left to soak. By midday, my hands were aching, and I was very grateful for the bowl of broth I was given by Mrs. Taylor, the cook. The afternoon was very similar, more pots and pans, and some silver to polish. At the end of the day, when I slowly made my way up to my bedroom, my hands were red and hurting. My back ached, and I was exhausted. I practically flopped onto the bed when I reached the room. Jane came up after me and forced me to get up and change, stating there was no need to mess up my dress any more than it already was. I reluctantly got up and got changed, and had no objection to Jane blowing out the candle as soon as possible. The book laying on the bedside table had not even crossed my mind. It was much better occupied with dreams of a restful night's sleep. The rest of the week passed, with nothing really of note occurring. Every morning I would be awoken by Jane, who I was beginning to really like. Her no-nonsense attitude did not make me dislike her, but rather look upon her as if she were an older sister. As the oldest sibling, I never knew what it was like to have someone to look up to, who weren't my parents. Every morning she would insist on tying my unruly mane of hair back out of my face. Then we would set to work, me lighting the fires, cleaning pots, and polishing cutlery, and Jane would go about tidying the house, serving the family at meals, and doing laundry. I settled into the routine of the house quickly, my body adjusting to the new work conditions. My hands began to harden, just enough to prevent them from being raw by the evening, and my stamina improved, meaning that at night time I had a little energy left to read more of Utopia. I also found that the cook, Mrs. Taylor, liked to talk while she worked. I began to become more comfortable in her company and started talking more. I even began to sing to pass the time while I worked. My voice was not especially good, but it amused me. I would sing songs that told stories, ballads of romances, and adventures were my favorite. Sunday arrived, and I was allowed to leave the manor for an afternoon, so I set off down the road to my home. It was a small cottage on the edge of the field Father worked on, with a thatched roof and small chimney. I could see the smoke rising from it as I walked toward the village. The weather was good, and although it was not warm, the cold was not as piercing and painful. I hadn't seen my family in a week, which was the longest I had ever been away from them. I had missed them, but not as much as I had expected to. I had thought I would have sleepless nights for not hearing all the sound of them sleeping, that I would miss the playing with them in the carefree manner and instantly want to return home. But I didn't get the urge. I think a part of me found my new situation to be different and a little thrilling, like I was finally starting to live my own life. As I approached the cottage, I could already hear the screams and shouts of my siblings from the path. I had no sooner crossed through the gate when the door opened and Tom, Richard, and Clara came running out, with Robbie and Gwen toddling behind them slowly. I was almost knocked over from the sheer force of them all. They told me all at once how they had missed me, and could I not just come back home to stay? But with the three of them speaking all at the same time, the sound that came out was more like a screen of noise, which I struggled to decipher. I only got the meaning of the sound after they had all calmed down and spoke to me individually. We eventually made it into the house, where my mother greeted me and told my siblings to run along. Alexander and Daniel, who had not rushed out to greet me, stood from where they sat at the table, playing a game of cards. They gave me a quick hug and carried the little ones outside to play. No sooner were they all outside that the screams and loud noises began again, I imagine much to the dismay of our neighbors. My mother embraced me and started to ask questions about the house, what it was like, was the family nice, was I being mistreated, and so forth. I told her all the events of the past week, and she listened closely. But as I spoke, I could see the lines around her face, the heavier, darker circles under her eyes. My mother had never really had a particularly strong constitution, and after 8 births and raising so many children, she was often tired. I guess it was simply the fact that I had not seen her in a week that made these features more prominent. They say you can notice changes in people if you don't see them every day. We spoke for a good while, me telling her about things that had happened and the new people that I was now living with, and I was told about the daily happenings of the house, that Tom had lost a tooth, Richard had scraped his knee when climbing, and the small play they had put on to amuse themselves. I smiled at this. I hadn't realized how much I had missed acting out stories to perform for our parents. We walked outside to go and see my brothers and sisters, and I found them in the middle of a game of blind man's bluff, with Daniel blindfolded. Alex carried Robbie on his back, and Clara held Gwen on her hip. They ran around, laughing and shrieking whenever Daniel got close. However, Daniel came up and tagged me, which earned me the task of wearing the old cloth. I threw myself into the game as much as I could, chasing after any and all sounds I heard. My mother laughed at all of us, and then went back inside. I could hear her retreating footsteps. I was not surprised. She often suffered from headaches and dizzy spells. I eventually caught Richard, and the game continued. We played games all afternoon long, and it wasn't until the sky began to darken that I realized I should be heading back to the manor. I bade my siblings goodbye, but was stopped by Gwen, who had decided to attach herself to my leg and not let go. This then caused Robbie to do the same thing to my other leg, but Alexander and Daniel managed to pry them off of me. I gave them all one last hug and ran inside to say farewell to my mother. But when I got inside, I found her asleep on the bed. I bent over and gave her a kiss on the forehead and left quietly. I walked out of the gate, waving at my brothers and sisters as I walked back up the path, back to the manor house.